Hi there, and welcome to the Cotswold Explorers 2022 Halloween livestream. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Let us know from where you're watching. And when you've finished watching, check out the link below for more ghost stories. Hi there, and welcome to the Cotswold Explorers 2022 Halloween special. We're going to take you on a whistle-stop tour of the southern Cotswolds to visit some of the more ghoulish and spooky places. Marauding crusaders, phantom ships, flying monks. We'll find them all. Come with us if you dare. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and if you want to hear more spooky stories from me, check out the link in the description. In 2021, we took you on a ghostly trail of the central Cotswolds. We visited some of the most haunted places the region has to offer, from phantom monks and moving stones all the way to wailing ghouls and demonic chariots. This year, we start in the sprawling settlements of Cheltenham and Gloucester, and then we move into the depths of the Cotswold Hills to the villages of Minchinhampton, Tetbury and Malmesbury. We visit the capital of the Cotswolds itself, Cirencester, before moving east to my home village of Brampton again. So come with us, if you dare. Those of you who watched our previous Halloween special will know that last time we began our trail in Prestbury, the most haunted village in the whole country. This time we're starting only a couple of miles away in the grand old town of Cheltenham. On the western edge of the Cotswolds, Cheltenham is as ancient as any other town in the county. As a royal manor, it features in the earliest pages of the Gloucestershire section of the Domesday Book and was awarded a market charter in 1226. We use this town as a starting point for one main reason. It is home, to quote the author Joseph Braddock, to the best accredited ghost story on record. This famous phantom has become known among the paranormal community simply as the Cheltenham Ghost. The apparition haunts a Georgian townhouse called Garden Reach on Pittville Circus Road. This most famous ghost of all was officially investigated by the Society for Psychical Research. Frederick Myers, who was the honorary secretary of the society, interviewed a number of first-hand witnesses. Many people had claimed to have seen it over the years, and contemporaneous records were taken on many occasions, in particular by a member of the family that lived in the house. The hauntings occurred between 1882 and 1886, just 20 years after the house was built. Garden Reach's first residents were an unhappy couple called Swinhoe. Mr. Swinhoe had taken to drink, apparently never able to get over the death of his first wife. His second wife, Imogen, was very poorly treated as a result, and subsequently, or should I say consequently, she hit the bottle too. After years of booze and argument, they finally succumbed, together perhaps for the first time, to the alcohol. The next family to move in were the Despards. Captain Despard and his wife never experienced anything particularly ghostly, beyond inexplicable noises and the sound of feet apparently traipsing the passages and stairs. However, their servants, children and guests all claimed to see the ghost. Perhaps the most articulate witness was their 19-year-old daughter Rose. Her account of her first sighting of the ghost is recorded as follows. I had gone up to my room, but was not yet in bed, when I heard someone at the door, and went to it, thinking it might be my mother. On opening the door, I saw no one, but on going a few steps along the passage, I saw the figure of a tall lady, dressed in black, standing at the head of the stairs. After a few moments, she descended the stairs, and I followed for a short distance, feeling curious who it could be. I had only a small piece of candle, and it suddenly burned itself out. Being unable to see any more, I went back to my room. The figure was a tall lady dressed in black, of a soft woolen material, judging from the slight sound when she moved. Her face was hidden by a handkerchief held in the right hand. This is all I noticed then, but on further occasions when I was able to observe her more closely, I saw the upper part of the left side of her forehead and a little of the hair above. Her left hand was nearly hidden by her sleeve and a fold of her dress, but as she held it down, a portion of a widow's cuff was visible on both wrists, so that the whole impression was that of a lady in widow's weeds. During the 2 years from 1882 to 1884, she claimed to see the figure about a dozen times, initially with long intervals that gradually grew shorter with each appearance. On one occasion, Rose approached the phantom and attempted to speak to it. Rose was convinced it was attempting to reply, but all she heard was a sigh, and the ghost sidestepped her and disappeared into the darkness. On other occasions, the family heard mysterious footsteps, bangs, bumps, and the turning of door handles by invisible hands. In 1948, years after the Despards had left, a full review of the case was published by psychical researcher B. Abdy Collins. Garden Reach had become a boarding school for boys in the 1900s, but was forced to move because of the regular appearance of the ghost. Shortly after this, the building was converted into flats, renamed St. Anne's, since when no further reports of ghostly activity have ever been reported. Of course, this isn't the only haunted place in Cheltenham. In the General Hospital, a grey lady, looking like an old-fashioned nurse, has been encountered on a number of occasions. She was reported as wearing a shroud, looking very pale and ghastly, suddenly appearing outside the door to the mortuary. This was witnessed first by a terrified employee who ran away in panic. She never saw the apparition again, but many others did. Ross Andrews' website, Paranormal Cheltenham, tells the tale of a haunted house in Montpellier Terrace where ghostly voices, footsteps, and inexplicable noises could be heard. This was all just a trailer to the sudden appearance of shadowy, toad-like creatures emerging from under a bed and crawling straight through the skirting board as if it were not there. There have been many more ghostly sightings in this town, including a man sporting a World War II gas mask and shadowy figures on the balcony at the Playhouse Theatre. Cheltenham is a beautiful town and well worth a visit, whether or not you're interested in or believe in these spooky tales. The neighbouring city of Gloucester also boasts a variety of ghostly tales. We had the pleasure of visiting Gloucester Cathedral in our Easter special, and that is where we're heading next. The cathedral, built shortly after the Norman conquest, provides many reasons for you to visit. The breathtaking medieval cloister, the huge east window, and of course the burial place of Edward II. But this story involves the highly decorated Victorian organ. This first-hand account is by Miss Agnes Weston. Dating from the late 19th century, she practiced on the instrument for 5 hours every single day, and as a result was often in the cathedral after dark. One evening, her tutor was called away, and because of regulations she had to be temporarily locked inside the building. Now, Miss Weston did not believe in ghosts, but she was aware of a legend that under the organ loft a medieval crusader was buried. It was said that he would walk down the nave after dark, his mailed feet and spurs echoing all round the church. He'd head to the west end of the cathedral before returning up one of the side aisles, where his footsteps would stop just when they reached his grave. Shortly after her tutor left her, this is exactly what Miss Weston heard. The organ blower emerged from his position in the heart of the organ loft, white and trembling, for he had heard it too. They both listened as the footsteps faded, then returned from the west end of the building. They came nearer and nearer, pausing at the foot of the organ loft stairs. Miss Weston said later, "I must say that I felt my flesh creep, and I was sure that something supernatural was happening, but I crushed my fears, and, lantern in hand, ran down the stairs to see. Absolutely nothing." Another story tells of a 14-year-old apprentice who fell to his death from the scaffolding during the construction of the cathedral. His troublesome spirit lurked around the site until a ceremony of exorcism was held, which supposedly eased his passage to the afterlife. Counterintuitively, the method used seems to have been to coax his spirit into a leather bottle and then to bury it in one of the cathedral's pillars. His spirit, perhaps not surprisingly, was never to cause a nuisance again. The author of Paranormal Gloucester, Lynn Cinderley, also tells of a first-hand account of a creepy encounter in Gloucester Cathedral. A Mr. David Leach recounted how, as a young boy, he was helping catalogue books in the cathedral library. He was on his own when he heard a deep, disembodied voice in his ear. "When are you going to leave?" the voice demanded. Mr. Leach thought he'd imagined the voice, but a few seconds later it was repeated, sounding angrier. Mr. Leach was not going to argue with the ghost, and so hurried out of the room. He was later informed that the library had been created in a space formerly used as a mortuary for medieval monks. Leaving the cathedral, we head down to the Gloucester docks. These Gloucester docks are a recently restored tourist hotspot, with plenty of history. There are tales of ghost ships in these docks. One is said to take the form of a Spanish bark in which a terrible murder took place when it was moored here, just here, some 2 centuries ago. As dawn rose around the old dock, 2 Spanish sailors were spotted, hanging upside down from the yardarm. Their throats had been slit, and their blood had soaked into the deck below during the night. Their killers were never caught, though it was believed the men were murdered by fellow Spaniards from a rival trading vessel. Another story tells of a sailor who was walking along the dockside one night when he noticed an incredibly dilapidated old ship tied up alongside the quay. A dim light came from one of the portholes. His curiosity getting the better of him, he decided to investigate. Climbing aboard, he found his way to the cabin where he'd seen the light, only to be driven away by a strange, angry man wearing a mustard-coloured coat and cap, apparently floating feet above the ground. The terrified sailor ran for his life. When he returned to his shipmates and recounted the tale, they asked him, "What ship?" He looked out to the dock, and sure enough there was no ship to be seen. Nor had there been, they said, the entire time they were in port. There are many other haunted places in Gloucester. The Greyfriars Inn on Southgate Street is home to a troublesome poltergeist, and at an old school in Archdeacon Street the ghost of a teacher haunts the place, apparently expressing her unhappiness about alterations made to the school. We hear they called in a medium. The spirit was placated, and the haunting has stopped. We're told that Gloucester has a handful of haunted pubs, as well as a haunted prison. So do come and discover more for yourself. We are moving south, heading for the village of Minchinhampton. We're heading for the Ragged Cot Inn. This pub was built in the 17th century as a coaching inn, and to this day makes for a wonderful place to stay and to eat. Their ghost hails from 1760, when the Ragged Cot's landlord, Bill Clevers, had just had his first child. He was not a rich man, and with the new mouth to feed, he badly needed a cash injection of some kind. And he decided he would rob the stagecoach, which passed by the inn at around midnight. He took some rum to steady his nerves, loaded up 2 pistols, and staggered outside in the direction of the stagecoach. On his way out, his wife, child in arms, tried to dissuade him from his crazy plan, but he pushed her aside, causing her to fall down the stairs. He stepped over the 2 prone bodies of his wife and child, and armed and masked, walked out into the darkness, where he successfully robbed the coach. He arrived back at the inn, sobering up fast, where to his horror he found his wife and child lying at the bottom of the stairs, stone dead. Not only was he now a robber, he was a murderer too. Meanwhile, the local constables, tracking Clever's footsteps through the snow from the scene of the robbery, sensed some commotion within the Ragged Cot pub. And as the constables prepared to force an entry at the front door, they heard a shriek of terror from within. Forcing open the door, they found Bill Clevers a gibbering wreck, the bodies of his wife and child dead at his feet. They managed to wrangle a confession out of the broken man. Clevers told them he had dragged the bodies down to the cellar, where he had tried to hide them in a trunk. He said that the ghosts of his wife and child had appeared to him whilst he had attempted to conceal their corpses, and made him carry them back upstairs. He was taken away, tried for murder, found guilty, and sentenced to be hanged. Following the tragedy, eerie crying noises have often been heard from the cellar, and the ghost of Mrs. Clevers, her baby in her arms, has been spotted on the stairs many times by guests staying at the inn. There have been sightings of ghostly horsemen and a phantom hound around the roads of Minchinhampton. And the long stone just past Hollybush Farm has strong supernatural associations. We'll go and have a look. This enormous rock is alleged to move around the field in which it stands, always at midnight, and occasionally it wanders to the nearby spring in Minchinhampton to have a drink. It's also said to hold certain mystical properties. Mothers treated their children for smallpox or rickets by passing them through the gap in the stone. Legend also says that the rock contains pure gold, but that it's guarded by a ferocious ghost, perhaps a large spectral dog or wolf of some kind. We now leave Minchinhampton and head further south to Malmesbury, but on the way we'll drop in on Tetbury to hear a couple more tragic ghostly tales. We've spoken before of the wonderful Chavenage house and the legend of a headless King Charles I arriving to collect the body of Colonel Nathaniel Stevens. Stevens was involved in the decision to execute the king. Now, at regular intervals, a coach with 4 black horses, driven by the headless king, arrives at the house in complete silence. As it draws up to the house, Stephen's ghost enters the vehicle, and it leaves Chavenage, bursting into flames as it reaches the end of the drive. But there's another sad tale from the Civil War. a tragic story of love found and lost. Chavenage House was in the hands of the parliamentarians under Colonel Massey, who gave orders to attack the nearby royalist stronghold of Beverstone Castle, just down the road. After a couple of attacks failed on the castle, and it had become clear that royalists had known they were coming, Massey became suspicious. He discovered that a maid from Chavenage House was secretly signalling to her lover, Commander Oglethorpe, of the Beverstone garrison. She had been placing a candle in a small window to show him all was well and that no attacks were planned from Chavenage on that night, and that it was safe for him to visit her. The maid was seized and held prisoner at Chavenage. A candle was placed in the window to trick Oglethorpe. He made his way to Chavenage under the cloak of darkness to meet his young girl. He was ambushed, and the Beverstone stronghold was attacked. After a brief siege, the castle fell, and Oglethorpe's bloodied body was hung from the ramparts as a grisly warning. When the young girl was told what had happened, she took her own life. Her ghost, now known as the White Lady, has been seen wandering the fields between Chavenage and Beverstone, desperately trying to warn her lover not to approach. There are even more ghostly tales here at Chavenage. Stories of discomfort and claustrophobia in the room where Oliver Cromwell spent the night, as well as phantom monks in the nearby chapel. But for now, however, we're heading southeast towards Malmesbury. As we have discussed many times on this channel, Henry VIII's Reformation saw the destruction of many religious buildings, particularly around the Cotswolds. And it's difficult to imagine that Malmesbury Abbey, amazing as it is now, would have been far larger and grander before the Reformation. This abbey was spared complete destruction, and what's left was retained as the parish church. The ghost of a Benedictine monk has been spotted wandering the cemetery, and the sound of chanting has been heard coming from within the monastery walls after dark. One tale tells of a young monk called Elmer, who lived at the abbey and had become obsessed with the idea of flying. Having heard of the fabled flight of Icarus, he too set about the task of making some wings to take him to the sky. One day, his wings complete, he climbed to the top of one of the abbey's towers and jumped off. Not surprisingly, a large group of curious onlookers watched from below. He succeeded in flying a remarkable distance before crashing to the ground, breaking his legs. Undeterred by his injuries, he worked to perfect his wing designs, but when the news reached the bishop, he was banned from attempting any further flights. A hooded monk has been seen many times around the grounds. From time to time he reportedly pauses, then raises his arms skyward in a kind of eureka gesture. Could it be that this apparition is in fact Elmer, joyful at seeing mankind finally take to the skies? That'd be fun. Next door to the abbey is the oldest hotel in Britain, the Old Bell. The foundations date back to 1220. It's no surprise, therefore, that this place has some spooky stories. It's believed that the east wing of the hotel was constructed on part of the abbey churchyard, and there may be several sarcophagi concealed beneath the hotel bar. Phantoms are the order of the day. One of the most commonly spotted phantoms is another grey lady. She's been seen in the James Odie room by staff and residents alike, described as looking melancholy and sad as she glides around the room. I hear tell that if the words grey lady are spoken out loud 3 times within that room, then she will appear. Guests have reported having their belongings thrown across the room by an invisible force, and night staff have reported hearing unexplained sounds and feeling cold shivers during their shifts. Now we travel north to the ancient Roman town of Cirencester, the titular capital of the Cotswolds. Right in the centre, the King's Head pub is home to a resident ghost. It's possible that this pub stands roughly on the spot of what was a Roman staging post when Cirencester thrived as the second largest town in the country. Its most famous ghost is that of a shadowy monk, apparently with no face. He's most commonly seen on the stairs, and one staff member's encounter with him led to her quitting her job rather than face the possibility of seeing him again. It's also home to a ghostly cavalier. It is thought he was a casualty of a skirmish that took place in 1688 between supporters of William of Orange and those of the Stuarts. The man, called Whitelock, was hit by a musket ball and later died in a room in the hotel. The room was named the Whitelock Suite in his honour. On one occasion, a terrified employee looked up from his work to see the phantom cavalier pointing a pistol at his head. Strange noises, hurled objects, and a mysterious fireball have also been reported in the room, and a terrified wailing has been heard, echoing throughout the place. Not far away, just past the church, are the old Abbey grounds. There are several reports of an old gentleman dressed in Victorian clothes walking towards the river after dark, and inevitably a phantom monk has been spotted in the area. Now we move further east. We've now arrived at our penultimate destination on this ghost tour, my home village of Brampton. There is a chilling tale of an exorcism at Brampton Manor House, an imposing 18th century building that was built on the site of an earlier farmhouse. The residents of the house were troubled by a shadowy poltergeist, and so they enlisted professional help from a religious figure to perform an exorcism. It was common practice to summon the restless spirit in question and then trap it in some kind of vessel. Some of you may remember the story of the Tanfields in Burford, who were coaxed into a bottle and buried in the river Windrush after their flaming chariot terrorised the town. They threatened to reappear when the river ran particularly dry. Something to think about in 2022, during the driest summer in living memory. Here, however, the unusual container used to trap the spirit was a barrel of beer. Rather than dispose of the barrel, the family chose to keep it below the house in the cellar, where it apparently stayed for donkey's years. As the location of the barrel has now been lost to the mists of time, somewhere a troublesome spirit could be awaiting its release. Perhaps this place is in danger of being overrun with spirits. There is another legend surrounding the church in Brampton, behind me. If you want to know who in the village is going to die in the next year, it's possible to find out by coming here to St Mary's Church at midnight on October the 31st. If you wait by the church's west doorway, you will witness a procession of all the elderly and sick people in the village slowly making their way into the church, apparently vanishing through the closed door. Not long after, they will re-emerge from the church, only this time, only those that would survive the next 12 months will reappear. If you are unlucky enough to see your loved ones enter the church, but fail to reappear, you will know their time on earth is coming to an end. I think I'll make arrangements to be on holiday that week. For our final tale, we journey a few miles north to the ancient market town of Witney. Not quite in the area of outstanding natural beauty, but with an interesting story to tell nonetheless. Since as far back as the 11th century, every year a large procession celebrated the Easter religious holiday, moving through the town and across the river Windrush. Various effigies and puppets representing biblical figures were carried aloft, and a great time was had by one and all. However, what started as a religious ceremony organised by the church soon became more of a rowdy celebration. It attracted more and more people who attended the event more to drink and make merry than to celebrate the rebirth of Christ. And as a result, the church decided to ban the procession. This did not go down well with the locals, who looked forward to the processions each year. The following Easter, a drunken mob formed in the town and threatened to destroy the bridge over the Windrush if the church did not lift their ban. It seems a young and inexperienced priest confronted the mob, attempting to stop the rabble from any precipitous action. The mob saw this as the church digging its heels in, and the novice priest was flung from the bridge, where he drowned in the rushing waters of the river. Legend has it that if you go to the bridge on the third evening after Easter and look down into the water, you will see a phantom drowned cleric floating face down in the water as it passes beneath the bridge. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of tonight's ghost stories in the Cotswolds. All the way from Cheltenham and Gloucester in the south, we've covered everything from ghostly crusaders to phantom boats, poltergeists in pubs, and myths of Neolithic stones. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more exploration of the Cotswolds, and follow us on Instagram. If you enjoy ghost stories, be sure to check out our other newly minted YouTube channel dedicated solely to exploring haunted places and horrific tales up and down the country. The link is below. Our guidebooks are also available, so you can follow the ghostly trails yourselves by visiting the link in the description. Available in paperback, Kindle, and of course, audiobook. Happy Halloween and safe travels. If you're enjoying our spooky stuff, you can now enjoy even more over on our sister channel. Follow the link in the description and you'll find a world of even more ghoulish and ghastly stories. Our next story on tonight's live stream is The Grey Wolf by George MacDonald. One evening twilight in spring, a young English student who had wandered northwards as far as the outlying fragments of Scotland called the Orkney and Shetland Islands found himself on a small island of the latter group, caught in a storm of wind and hail which had come on suddenly. It was in vain to look about for any shelter, for not only did the storm entirely obscure the landscape, but there was nothing around him save a desert moss. At length, however, as he walked on for mere walking's sake, he found himself on the verge of a cliff, and saw over the brow of it, a few feet below him, a ledge of rock where he might find some shelter from the blast, which blew from behind. Letting himself down by his hands, he alighted upon something that crunched beneath his tread, and found the bones of many small animals scattered about in front of a little cave in the rock, offering the refuge he sought. He went in and sat upon a stone. The storm increased in violence, and as the darkness grew he became uneasy, for he didn't relish the thought of spending the night in the cave. He had parted from his companions on the opposite side of the island, and it added to his uneasiness that they must be full of apprehension about him. At last there came a lull in the storm, and the same instant he heard a footfall, stealthy and light as that of a wild beast, upon the bones at the mouth of the cave. He started up in some fear, though the least thought might have satisfied him that there could be no very dangerous animals upon the island. Before he had time to think, however, the face of a woman appeared in the opening. Eagerly the wanderer spoke. She started at the sound of his voice. He couldn't see her well because she was turned towards the darkness of the cave. "Will you tell me how to find my way across the moor to Sheelness?" he asked. "You cannot find it tonight," she answered in a sweet tone, and with a smile that bewitched him, revealing the whitest of teeth. "What am I to do, then?" "My mother will give you shelter, but that's all she has to offer." "And that is far more than I expected a minute ago," he replied. "I shall be most grateful." She turned in silence and left the cave. The youth followed. She was barefooted, and her pretty brown feet went cat-like over the sharp stones as she led the way down a rocky path to the shore. Her garments were scanty and torn, and her hair blew tangled in the wind. She seemed about 25, lithe and small. Her long fingers kept clutching and pulling nervously at her skirts as she went. Her face was very grey in complexion and very worn, but delicately formed and smooth-skinned. Her thin nostrils were tremulous as eyelids, and her lips, whose curves were faultless, had no colour to give sign of indwelling blood. What her eyes were like he couldn't see, for she had never lifted the delicate films of her eyelids. At the foot of the cliff they came upon a little hut leaning against it, and having for its inner apartment a natural hollow within. Smoke was spreading over the face of the rock, and the grateful odour of food gave hope to the hungry student. His guide opened the door of the cottage, and he followed her in, and saw a woman bending over a fire in the middle of the floor. On the fire lay a large fish, broiling. The daughter spoke a few words, and the mother turned and welcomed the stranger. She had an old and very wrinkled but honest face, and looked troubled. She dusted the only chair in the cottage, and placed it for him by the side of the fire, opposite the one window whence he saw a little patch of yellow sand, over which the spent waves spread themselves out listlessly. Under this window there was a bench, upon which the daughter threw herself in an unusual posture, resting her chin upon her hand. A moment after, the youth caught the first glimpse of her blue eyes. They were fixed upon him with a strange look of greed, amounting to craving, but as if aware that they had belied or betrayed her, she dropped them instantly. The moment she veiled them, her face, notwithstanding its colourless complexion, was almost beautiful. When the fish was ready, the old woman wiped the deal table, steadied it upon the uneven floor, and covered it with a piece of fine table linen. She then laid the fish on a wooden platter and invited the guest to help himself. Seeing no other provision, he pulled from his pocket a hunting knife and divided a portion from the fish, offering it to the mother first. "Come, my lamb," said the old woman, and the daughter approached the table, but her nostrils and mouth quivered with disgust. The next moment she turned and hurried from the hut. "She doesn't like fish," said the old woman, "and I haven't anything else to give her." "She doesn't seem in good health," he rejoined. The woman answered only with a sigh, and they ate their fish with the help of a little rye bread. As they finished their supper, the youth heard the sound as of the pattering of a dog's feet upon the sand close to the door, but ere he had time to look out of the window, the door opened and the young woman entered. She looked better, perhaps from having just washed her face. She drew a stool to the corner of the fire opposite him, but as she sat down, to his bewilderment and even horror, the student spied a single drop of blood on her white skin within her torn dress. The woman brought out a jar of whisky, put a rusty old kettle on the fire, and took her place in front of it. As soon as the water boiled, she proceeded to make some toddy in a wooden bowl. Meantime, the youth could not take his eyes off the young woman, so that at length he found himself fascinated, or rather bewitched. She kept her eyes for the most part veiled with the loveliest eyelids fringed with darkest lashes, and he gazed entranced, for the red glow of the little oil lamp covered all the strangeness of her complexion. But as soon as he met a stolen glance out of those eyes unveiled, his soul shuddered within him. Lovely face and craving eyes alternated fascination and repulsion. The mother placed the bowl in his hands. He drank sparingly and passed it to the girl. She lifted it to her lips, and as she tasted, only tasted it, looked at him, he thought the drink must have been drugged and have affected his brain. Her hair smoothed itself back and drew her forehead backwards with it, while the lower part of her face projected towards the bowl, revealing, ere she sipped, her dazzling teeth in strange prominence. But at the same moment the vision vanished. She returned the vessel to her mother, and rising, hurried out of the cottage. Then the old woman pointed to a bed of heather in one corner, with a murmured apology, and the student, wearied both with the fatigues of the day and the strangeness of the night, threw himself upon it, wrapped in his cloak. The moment he lay down, the storm began afresh, and the wind blew so keenly through the crannies of the hut that it was only by drawing his cloak over his head that he could protect himself from its currents. Unable to sleep, he lay listening to the uproar which grew in violence, till the spray was dashing against the window. At length the door opened, and the young woman came in, made up the fire, drew the bench before it, and lay down in the same strange posture, with her chin propped on her hand and elbow, and her face turned towards the youth. He moved a little. She dropped her head and lay on her face, with her arms crossed beneath her forehead. The mother had disappeared. Drowsiness crept over him. A movement of the bench roused him, and he fancied he saw some 4-footed creature, as tall as a large dog, trot quietly out of the door. He was sure he felt a rush of cold wind. Gazing fixedly through the darkness, he thought he saw the eyes of the damsel encountering his, but a glow from the falling together of the remnants of the fire revealed clearly enough that the bench was vacant. Wondering what could have made her go out in such a storm, he fell fast asleep. In the middle of the night, he felt a pain in his shoulder, came broad awake, and saw the gleaming eyes and grinning teeth of some animal close to his face. Its claws were in his shoulder, and its mouth in the act of seeking his throat. Before it had fixed its fangs, however, he had its throat in one hand and sought his knife with the other. A terrible struggle followed, but regardless of the tearing claws, he found and opened his knife. He had made one futile stab and was drawing it for a surer, when with a spring of the whole body and one wildly contorted effort, the creature twisted its neck from his hold, and with something betwixt a scream and a howl, darted from him. Again he heard the door open. Again the wind blew in upon him, and it continued blowing. A sheet of spray dashed across the floor and over his face. He sprung from his couch and bounded to the door. A gruesome sound, as of mingled weeping and howling, came from somewhere in the dark. He turned again into the hut and closed the door, but could find no way of securing it. The lamp was nearly out, and he could not be certain whether the form of the young woman was upon the bench or not. Overcoming a strong repugnance, he approached it and put out his hands. There was nothing there. He sat down and waited for the daylight. He dared not sleep any more. When the day dawned at length, he went out yet again and looked around. The morning was dim and gusty and grey. The wind had fallen, but the waves were tossing wildly. He wandered up and down the little strand, looking for more light. At length he heard a movement in the cottage. By and by, the voice of the old woman called to him from the door. "You're up early, sir. I doubt you didn't sleep well." "Not very well," he answered. "But where's your daughter?" "She's not awake yet," said the mother. "I'm afraid I have but a poor breakfast for you, but you'll take a dram and a bit of fish. It's all I got." Unwilling to hurt her, though hardly in good appetite, he sat down at the table. While they were eating, the daughter came in, but turned her face away and went to the farther end of the hut. When she came forward after a minute or two, the youth saw that her hair was drenched and her face whiter than before. She looked ill and faint, and when she raised her eyes, all their fierceness had vanished, and sadness had taken its place. Her neck was now covered with a cotton handkerchief. She was modestly attentive to him, and no longer shunned his gaze. He was gradually yielding to the temptation of braving another night in the hut and seeing what would follow, when the old woman spoke. "The weather will be broken all day, sir," she said. "You'd better be going, or your friends will leave without you." Ere he could answer, he saw such a beseeching glance on the face of the girl that he hesitated, confused. Glancing at the mother, he saw the flash of wrath in her face. She rose and approached her daughter with her hand lifted to strike her. The young woman stooped her head with a cry. He darted round the table to interpose between them, but the mother had caught hold of her. The handkerchief had fallen from her neck, and the youth saw 5 blue bruises on her lovely throat, the marks of the 4 fingers and the thumb of her left hand. With a cry of horror, he darted from the house, but as he reached the door, he turned. His hostess was lying motionless on the floor, and a huge grey wolf came bounding after him. There was no weapon at hand, and if there had been, his inborn chivalry would have never allowed him to harm a woman, even under the guise of a wolf. Instinctively he set himself firm, leaning a little forward, with half-outstretched arms, and hands curved, ready to clutch again at the throat upon which he had left those pitiful marks. But the creature, as she sprung, eluded his grasp, and just as he expected to feel her fangs, he found a woman weeping on his bosom, with her arms round his neck. The next instant the grey wolf broke from him and bounded howling up the cliff. Recovering himself as he best might, the youth followed, for it was the only way to the moor above, across which he must now make his way to find his companion. All at once he heard the sound of a crunching of bones, not as if a creature was eating them, but as if they were ground by the teeth of rage and disappointment. Looking up, he saw close above him the mouth of the little cavern in which he had taken refuge the day before. Summoning all his resolution, he passed it slowly and softly. From within came the sounds of a mingled moaning and growling. Having reached the top, he ran at full speed for some distance across the moor before venturing to look behind him. When at length he did so, he saw against the sky the girl standing on the edge of the cliff, wringing her hands. One solitary wail crossed the space between them. She made no attempt to follow him, and he reached the opposite shore in safety. Next up, we have some true and truly horrific tales from the Cotswolds. Hi there, and welcome to the Cotswold Explorers 2022 Halloween special. In this episode, we're going to introduce you to some of the most gruesome true stories of police brutality, murder and mayhem, all from the Cotswold region. Come with us if you dare. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and if you want to hear more spooky stories from me, check out the link in the description. On the 7th of September 1846, a feast was held at Great Barrington, organised by George Talbot Rice, the 3rd Baron Dynevor. He gave it to thank the many villagers who worked on his estate, Barrington Park. Local feasts of this kind had been known to end in argument and violence as a result of alcoholic overindulgence, but on this occasion it had been a peaceful affair. When the evening came to an end, the guests dispersed, many of them to continue their fun in the local inns. One of these inns was the Fox in the village of Windrush. A couple of groups arrived here from the feast, threw all the money they had between them onto the bar, and told the landlord to keep the food and drink coming. One party, rather more sober and respectful than others, was led by one Reuben Busby, and included, amongst others, his friend John Clifford. As the evening progressed, the mood in the pub changed, when a drunken man, not part of Reuben's group, created something of a disturbance and smashed a glass on the floor. The landlord tried to get the man to pay for the damage, which he emphatically refused to do, and so the police were called. Sergeant Adams and two of his constables soon arrived, one of them a James Probert, an over-keen young man who pushed an elderly woman to the ground as he entered the pub. Reuben's friend Clifford saw no need for this kind of treatment and complained of the police's unnecessary aggression, and all others present supported his view. At this rather sensitive moment, the second constable left the room, and Probert drew his truncheon. He began striking people at random, swinging it left and right. This despite the fact that no one in the pub was causing any kind of trouble. The sergeant stood at the inn's door, watching, clearly without any intention of stopping his subordinate's violent outburst. Clifford was hit several times by the swinging truncheon, and falling to the floor would have been in very serious trouble if not for the prompt action of the others in the inn. They dragged him out of the room to safety. Probert then turned his attention to Reuben himself, who had been sitting quietly at a table minding his own business. He struck him on the crown of his head, and he fell to the ground, apparently lifeless. It took pretty much everybody else in the pub, including the landlord, to stop Probert from continuing his violent spree, and Reuben was carried outside to get some air. Even with the help of a local surgeon from Burford, who quickly arrived to help, Reuben's case was hopeless. He died that night of his injuries. Clifford was also severely injured. Such was the anger over Probert's behaviour that, even before it was known Reuben had died, he was taken into custody for his own protection, with the help of another officer from Great Barrington. At Reuben's inquest, Probert tried to claim that he had acted in self-defence. This went squarely against the accounts of 13 witnesses. They were all cross-examined by Probert's solicitor, but all remained firm in their story that there had been no rioting at the inn, and nothing warranted the kind of violence Probert had dished out. The coroner, one John Barnett, gave the jury 3 verdict choices: justifiable homicide, manslaughter, or murder. After some deliberation, they decided on manslaughter, and on the 19th of September, Probert was formally committed for trial. Even though the policeman had only been charged with the lesser crime of manslaughter, and despite the clear evidence against him, the jury acquitted him. It turned out later that the local lawyer prosecuting Probert had known him for years. Indeed, according to Probert's employment record, they'd lived together for 3 years. Was it any surprise, then, that he was acquitted? The local police's reputation at this time was far from great, and examples like this caused faith in the rural police to decline even further. As long as young men with little experience were employed supposedly to protect the local population, these problems would inevitably continue. On the other side of the A40, in the ancient wool town of Northleach, a prison had been built in the 1790s, which at the time was considered a leading example of modern correctional incarceration. In October 1842, a sawyer named Charles Beale died of tuberculosis at his father's house in Cheltenham. He was just 23 years old. His illness and subsequent death sparked an inquiry that shook the government and people all across Victorian England. The inquiry was into the conditions at Northleach House of Correction, just a few miles along the A40 from the Fox Inn. Charles had spent 6 months as a prisoner here in Northleach. He went in healthy, but came out with badly diseased lungs. 4 other recently discharged prisoners also complained about the treatment they received whilst incarcerated here. When he gave evidence to the inquiry, his ominous final words were that if he died, it would be because he had been murdered by the treatment given to him in Northleach Prison. Charles was born in Cheltenham and had a poor upbringing. He followed in his father's footsteps to become a sawyer. He partnered up with a man called Joseph Rowley, and in order to make a success of their business, they needed materials to work with. They stole 2 mahogany boards from a man called Jeremiah Wheeler. They were caught red-handed and charged with theft. Each was given a term of 6 months' imprisonment to be served at Northleach House of Correction. At the time, there was already an inquiry underway into the conditions at the prison. Several applications for parish poor relief had been made by people who claimed they were disabled and unable to work as a result of their treatment there. William Hollis was appointed to conduct the inquiry, which started on the 22nd of September 1842, by which time Charles Beale was already gravely ill. Charles himself had applied for parish relief before the start of the inquiry, and Hollis recorded that he was so ill he could barely stand. It seems it wasn't so much how prisoners were treated by the officers in the prison, but more the excessive labour they were expected to do, the quality of the prison food, and the damp, cold cells. It seems people entered in perfectly good health and left malnourished, ill, and unable to work. Charles's partner Joseph was also taken ill during this time there, blaming it on being overworked and not having enough to eat. Several other healthy young men who committed petty crimes were subjected to the same treatment. Illiterate labourer Joseph Wilson, rogue and vagabond John Newton, and labourer John Cook amongst them. The latter attended the inquiry in a wheelchair, which only emphasised just how bad the situation was at the prison. Just before his death, Charles recounted a vivid picture of life in Northleach. He said that the work was enough to kill an horse. After conducting a post-mortem on his emaciated body, the surgeon declared that the tuberculosis in Charles's lungs had certainly developed over the last 2 to 3 months. This piece of evidence piqued the interest of many high up in local and national government, and the inquiry became national news. People began to take note. They started to realize that many working men were being sent to prison for minor infringements from where they emerged unable to provide for their families, putting them into an even worse state of affairs. Despite this, the Gloucestershire magistrates, meeting to discuss the conditions of the prison, perhaps unsurprisingly, attacked the press coverage, insisting that Charles Beale had had perfectly adequate treatment. One magistrate went as far as to joke that some people had been committed many times, so the prison must be quite good or the offenders wouldn't keep returning to it. However, sense finally prevailed, and it was decided new measures should be taken. New windows were installed to warm the building. Surgeons examined prisoners upon entry to assess their medical needs, and the prison diet was changed. This was all too late for Charles Beale. He was buried on the 17th of October 1842, a week after his death, with a large crowd coming to pay their respects. We now move south towards Cirencester, stopping off at the woods in Chedworth. Poaching has been a common activity in the Cotswolds for hundreds of years. Generally, the landowners whose pheasants, rabbits and other game the poachers are after have always accepted that a bit of local petty theft goes with the territory. There are very few country people who, if a large cock pheasant strays into their garden to peck at the wheat kernels accidentally spilled on their lawn, won't pop a bullet in their air gun and snaffle the bird for the pot. However, there have always been a few that poach for financial gain. These are a bigger problem. Giles Coates, a man with a poor reputation who didn't care whom he crossed, was one such poacher who regularly raided the well-known Cotswold estate at Chedworth. In his day job he was a clock and watchmaker, but the locals knew him also to be a professional poacher. Born in 1783, he grew up in the Chedworth area and came from a perfectly respectable local family. In 1805, he married Sarah Restall in Northleach Church, and they had 5 children. He looked like any other middle-aged man, but he was recognizable from a distance because of his distinctive walk and round-shouldered posture. The estate in Chedworth was owned by a successful barrister, Lord Stowell. Covering thousands of acres on both sides of the River Colne, the estate employed a large number of people. The head gamekeeper, George Simper, was only 2 years older than Giles Coates, and had also spent many years living in Chedworth. He was a respectable, honest family man who worked hard to protect his employer's land and assets. But this didn't matter to a man like Giles Coates. On the 20th of October 1833, in the middle of the night, Giles Coates crept into Chedworth woods to see what he could poach. George Simper was on duty that night, and after hearing shots from the woods, went to investigate, assuming poachers to be at work. He came across Giles, confronted him, and tried to take his double-barreled shotgun away from him. Giles, however, not keen to be captured, hit the percussion cap with his knife, causing the gun to fire. George was hit by the blast and seriously injured. Giles fled the scene, leaving George Simper lying on the ground to his fate. It was a cold, damp autumn night, but fortunately Simper was discovered and carried home. His injuries were so serious that he was expected to die that night. Giles, meanwhile, escaped undetected. Giles soon realized that George Simper knew exactly who he was. After all, they'd both grown up together in the Chedworth area. He decided to travel to London, where he grew a beard to disguise himself. However, he didn't realize just how much publicity would be generated by the incident. A reward of £50 was soon offered for information on his whereabouts. Handbills were posted which read, £50 reward, whereas on the evening of Sunday, October the 20th, George Simper, gamekeeper to the Right Honourable Lord Stowell, at Chedworth in the county of Gloucester, while endeavouring to secure Giles Coates of Chedworth, aforesaid, who he detected in a wood in the unlawful pursuit of game, was deliberately fired at within the distance of 1 yard. So began the handout, the rest of it describing Giles's appearance. It even appeared in the newspapers. An ex-policeman called James Hall, now a farmer, was an acting parish constable in Northleach. It seems Giles had made the mistake of telling people where he planned to go, and James Hall followed him to London. For a whole month, James failed to locate the absconded poacher. Even then, London was a very large city. But in November 1833, Giles's luck ran out, and one night he happened to walk past James Hall in the street. James immediately recognized him, despite his disguise, and grabbed him. Giles tried to bribe him with a £5 note to let him go, but James refused, marching him to Bow Street Police Station, where he was taken into custody. He was tried and found guilty of the attempted murder of George Simper on the 29th of March 1834, and was facing a death sentence. However, the judge decided to spare Giles's life, instead sentencing him to be transported to Australia. On the 12th of December 1834, Giles left his family for the last time and sailed off in the convict ship George III, en route to the Antipodes. Tragically, however, the ship was destined for disaster. It struck a rock in the mouth of the River Derwent on the 12th of April 1835 and was completely wrecked. Only a few lucky individuals survived. Giles was not amongst them. At least, we don't think he was. On the brighter side, George Simper's story had a happier ending. Despite his injuries, he survived another 24 years, dying in Yanworth on the 7th of August 1858, at the then impressive age of 77. Our next story took place just a few miles from here, in the small village of Rendcome. But be warned, this tale is particularly sinister and gruesome. A young lady by the name of Sarah Moss lived in Rendcome, working as a servant to the Reverend Bloxham at North Nibley. During this employment she started a relationship with a local farmer, and in the autumn of 1859, at 29 years old and still unmarried, she had her first daughter, Elizabeth Louisa Moss. Despite the baby's illegitimacy, Elizabeth was baptised and lived at the Moss family home, a secluded cottage near the vicarage on the Cheltenham Road. Sarah shared a room with her daughter, and they lived across the road from another respectable family called the Mealings. John and Mary Mealing had a large number of children, and their oldest son, William, worked as an agricultural labourer. William was an independent man, having moved out of his family home at a young age to lodge with nearby neighbours, but by the autumn of 1859 he was lodging with the Moss family. Perhaps not surprisingly, in view of the close confines of the cottage, he developed a relationship with Sarah, and she became pregnant again in 1862. This time the relationship took a more conventional turn, and they were to be married in Rendcome Church in October 1862. Sarah took her impending marriage very seriously, saving whatever money she could towards the cost of the ceremony and a dowry. William, on the other hand, was not such a stable man. Once he'd been found sitting in a sort of trance in front of the unlit fire, freezing cold. Both his mother, Mary, and Sarah were extremely worried by his apparent illness. They cared for him, even sleeping in the same room to keep an eye on him. His condition seemed to improve for a while, but not for long. Not many days later, William complained to his mother of pain in his head, saying it was so bad he feared it might drive him out of his mind. Mary went to the local doctor for help, telling him that William was threatening to kill himself. She also told him that William had been praying aloud at night that he might not harm himself or anyone else. Dr. Lark promised to make up some medicine by 8 p.m. that night. William stayed with his mother until about 7 p.m, when, against her advice, he left to go to Sarah's house. Mary insisted on accompanying him, and they all sat in Sarah's cosy room drinking tea together. When Sarah went to put her child to bed, Mary told her not to be alarmed, but that William was not himself. She recommended she hide any knives and implements out of his reach, just to be safe. William was a good man, and he had told his mother when he was ill and thought he might be going to die, that she should offer the same love and care to Sarah that she'd shown to him. Eventually, Mary went home, everyone exchanging affectionate farewells. It wasn't long before disaster struck. In the early hours of Friday the 24th of October, 1862, William Mealing turned up at the home of local blacksmith Timothy Tarrant, who doubled as a parish constable. He'd known William his whole life and was his godfather. William said he'd come to Timothy's house to give himself up, for he had murdered Sarah at his lodgings. Timothy sent his son to fetch Mr. and Mrs. Mealing. When they arrived, they stayed with William whilst Timothy went to investigate at Moss Cottage. Lantern in hand, he was able to enter through the unlocked front door. The cottage was shrouded in darkness, and he heard a child crying from upstairs. He knew something was certainly amiss, and noticing a light in a neighbour's house, went over to get some support. They all went upstairs to Sarah's room, spotting bloodstains as they neared the door, and found her lying in bed, stone dead. Next to her was a shilling razor that belonged to William. It seemed clear what had happened. Sarah's 3-year-old daughter Elizabeth was in her little bed in the same room, completely distraught, staring at her dead mother. Timothy had no choice but to take William into custody, and it wasn't long before he was up before the Cirencester magistrates, and he was charged with the murder of Sarah Moss. One Mr. Rudd, a specialist who had examined William a couple of weeks before, had said he was bordering on homicidal mania. 2 other surgeons also gave evidence, saying he was not of sound mind and was suffering from some kind of religious mania. Taking all of this into account, the jury found him guilty of manslaughter. He was condemned to Broadmoor Asylum for the criminally insane, where he died 46 years later in 1908. We travel now a few miles south to Cirencester, the titular capital of the Cotswolds, where we come across a tale of 19th century political corruption. Feelings were running high in the lead up to the 1859 election to appoint 2 MPs for East Gloucestershire constituency. At this time, only male landowners with assets worth at least 40 shillings could vote. This meant that less than 20% of the male population were entitled to vote. Many supporters of both parties wanted to make sure those voters who'd previously voted the right way should do so again. So determined were the Liberal supporters that one of them, Henry Pole of Stratton House near Cirencester, gave the order to 3 of his servants to abduct a critical Cirencester voter in a bid to stop him voting Conservative. When the servants were arrested and charged, the judge strongly advocated that Henry Pole should be charged rather than his servants, but despite this, he escaped without charge. His reputation, however, suffered considerably as a result. The victim of the abduction was John Kipplewhite, a Cirencester local who had a road building and groundworking business with a special expertise in drainage repair. In the mid-19th century, votes were not held in secret, So John Kipplewhite was known to Henry Pole as a Tory. They knew each other quite well, and so when Kipplewhite overheard Pole's gardener Mullis asking around for him as he was passing by the plough in Stratton, he went over to see what he wanted. Mullis explained that his boss Henry Pole needed a drain unblocking. The next day was the nomination day for the election, so John wanted to hear the proceedings in Cirencester for an hour or so, but he agreed to carry out the work for Pole before the nominations were to be announced. He got to work at Stratton House for 4:30 a.m, managing a full 6 hours' work before heading into Cirencester for the nominations. He managed to take a break, enjoying a couple of pints in the butler's pantry before he left. After the nominations, Kipplewhite stopped in the plough, but drank nothing more, as he'd already had enough beer. Another of Pole's servants, Susanna Colburn, came in and asked Kipplewhite to join her in a pipe of tobacco, which he agreed to do. She then made him a cup of tea and took him upstairs. He drank the first cup of tea with enjoyment, but found the second not to his liking. It was darker in colour, and before he could inquire further about its funny taste, he drifted into unconsciousness. At around 9 p.m, he was smuggled onto a horse and carriage, driven by another servant called Jermyn Colburn. Mullis sat with the unconscious Kipplewhite in the back. William Carpenter, who manned the Stratton Turnpike gate, observed Kipplewhite in the back of the coach as it passed, draped in a shawl and leaning over to one side. The carriage passed by Kipplewhite's house, much to the confusion of his wife, who spotted it going by and saw him in his hunched position. She was even more troubled when he failed to turn up at all that night. Shortly after 10 p.m, the carriage arrived at the King's Head in the village of Ashton Keynes in Wiltshire. Jeremy Colburn knew the landlord well and claimed he had picked up Kipplewhite as a wandering drunk. He asked the landlord if he could put him up for the night, which with some reservations he agreed to do. Susanna met them at the King's Head, and the 3 conspiring servants topped up Kipplewhite's drugs to keep him quiet until after the election. They stayed for an hour or so before leaving. After a while, the landlord became worried for Kipplewhite's health. But fortunately he seemed to pull through and awoke to find himself in a strange room, in a strange bed. He hadn't the faintest idea where he was or what he was doing there. He set off full pelt for home, paying 6pence for his night's accommodation before he left. On the way, he began to feel ill again, but fortunately he was picked up by a carriage, taken to the Bear Inn and given some brandy and a cup of tea. A local surgeon deduced that he'd been drugged with a narcotic. After a few hours' sleep, against all odds, Kipplewhite managed to register his vote. The 3 servants responsible for the affair were all brought to justice and charged under the Corrupt Practices Prevention Act of 1854. The mastermind behind it all, the influential Henry Pole, escaped prosecution entirely. Kipplewhite survived the poisoning and went on to live a normal life. Moving west, we come to another classic Cotswolds town, Painswick. It sits high on the western escarpment and is the location for a particularly grim tale. A resident at the time of Henry VIII was one Sir Anthony Kingston. He was a staunch, indeed fanatical royalist, who inherited the manor of Painswick from his father. He'd gathered a small army to help King Henry suppress the Pilgrimage of Grace, a Catholic uprising that started in Yorkshire, an action for which Kingston was awarded a knighthood. He also became an agent for the king in his efforts to punish those who had supported the rebels. One such, the Mayor of Bodmin, got a message from Kingston that he would like to visit on such and such a date. The mayor was keen to impress and set up a dinner fit for a king. Before they sat down, Kingston said he wanted a gallows to be set up for a hanging that must take place after the meal. The mayor arranged it, and a dinner of great generosity was enjoyed by all. It was only after the meal that Kingston revealed that the gallows was for the mayor himself. For the support he had supposedly given to the rebels, he was to be hanged in his own garden. There is a story that the very last man hanged by the Painswick hangman was brought to him with great kerfuffle and urgency in the middle of the night by Kingston himself. The hangman, having been dragged from his bed, was not in the best of moods, and he hurriedly took the unfortunate victim, who was already hooded, gagged and bound, straight to the gallows and hanged him. It was only the next morning, when he came to cut him down from the rope and remove his hood, that he discovered it was his only and much-loved son. It's hardly surprising that this was the very last person over whose head he placed the hanging noose. Here endeth tonight's tour of horrific tales in the Cotswolds. We've had brutal prison conditions in Windrush and Northleach, as well as murders, poachers and poisoners in Cirencester and beyond. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and check out our Halloween guidebooks, following the link in the description. If you enjoy horrific tales, you can find even more on our sister channel. Join us again soon, when we'll be back to show you the beauty of the region, the picturesque villages, and wonderful stately homes. Hello. You find me on the day of Halloween in the depths of the Cotswolds, and I'm searching for some of the most gruesome tales told about the area. There are many of them. Some terrible things have happened in the Cotswolds in the past. I'm going to find them, and then I'm going to read them to you. The civil war in the Cotswolds resulted in some brutal and terrible actions. Conspiracy, deception, disloyalty, and revenge. The first story I'm going to tell you is what happened at Chavenage House. On a late December afternoon in 1648, a group of horsemen, led by Henry Ireton, son-in-law of Oliver Cromwell and leading parliamentarian, galloped along the rutted highways of the Cotswolds and then along the approach to Chavenage House. It was then that Henry Ireton and Nathaniel Stevens retired from the company and settled down to discuss the important matter that had brought him to Chavenage, the execution of their king, Charles I. With the Civil War now over and King Charles Stuart a prisoner, it had become apparent to Cromwell that the king would have to be executed if royalist uprisings were to be deterred. However, many of his supporters had balked at the prospect of committing regicide. Amongst them was Colonel Nathaniel Stevens, a mild man who wavered in making the decision to sacrifice the life of the king, and who, as Ireton arrived at his door, had almost made up his mind against it. The two men are reputed to have sat up all night discussing and arguing the point, and it was with great reluctance that the next morning Stevens finally acquiesced. Ireton returned to London, and on January the 30th, 1649, Charles Stuart, King of England, was beheaded outside Whitehall Palace in London. The fortunes of Nathaniel Stevens fared little better than those of the king. His daughter Abigail had been away at the time of Ireton's visit. Returning shortly after the New Year, she was furious at her father for bringing the family name into such disrepute, and in her anger she placed a curse upon him. Soon afterwards, Colonel Stevens was taken terminally ill. Shortly after his execution in 1649, the headless ghost of the king is reputed to have appeared at Chavenage House during the funeral of Colonel Stevens. The servants reported a mysterious black carriage, driven by a headless coachman, pulling into the drive and bursting into flames as it passed through the gates. In my continued efforts to find you gruesome tales from the Cotswolds, I was reminded of a story about a young Mercian king, told by our normal literary companion, Herbert Evans. I think this is the story I'm going to tell you next. On the death of Kenelm, king of Mercia, in 822, his son Kenelm, a boy of 7 years, succeeded to the throne of Mercia. Rendcome was then the royal residence, and there the little king began his reign under the guidance of his tutor, Ascorbert. Fortunately, or unfortunately for him, he had an elder sister, Gwenrhyd, who cast envious eyes upon the lad and sought to supplant him on the throne. With this end in view, she attempted to take him off by poison, but so saintly was the holy child that the noxious drugs had no power over him. Her next move was to whisper evil counsels in the ear of his tutor, the mercenary Ascorbert, and endeavour to win him over to her designs. In this she succeeded, and one fine morning Ascorbert invited the boy to accompany him on a hunting expedition to the forest of Clent in the north of Worcestershire. Kenelm was, of course, delighted with the proposal, and off rode the villain and his victim. When they reached the forest, the miscreant cut off the child's head and buried the corpse beneath a thorn bush. It should be said that at the moment that he severed the head from the body, a white dove came forth from the neck and straightway flew up to heaven. Gwenrhyd now reaped the fruit of her misdeed, for a time. But it so happened that a year or two later, as the Pope was celebrating Mass at the high altar of St. Peter's at Rome, a dove flew into the building and dropped a slip of parchment upon the altar. His Holiness, observing a certain writing upon the parchment, attempted to read it, but without success, a thing which was not wonderful, seeing that the language was English, then an unknown tongue in the Holy City. At last an Englishman was found who could read and interpret the writing, which ran thus: In Clent, in Caubach, Kenelm, kings, bern lith, under thorn hoand buried. That is, in Clent, in Caubach, Kenelm, king's child, lieth under a thorn, his head taken from him. Thereupon the Pope lost no time in sending these strange tidings to the Archbishop of Canterbury, and orders came down to Rendcome that a search should be made for the murdered child's body. Accordingly, a party of monks set off for Clent and arrived at the Caubach, where a white cow, herself long a devotee of the saint, guided them to the thorn bush. Here they found the body, and were about to take it back with them to Winchcombe, when a difficulty arose. The monks of Worcester put in a claim to the body as having been found in their province, while the Gloucestershire men as vehemently asserted their claims as fellow townsmen of the saint. At last they agreed that, weary as they were, they should all lie down to sleep, and whichever party woke up first should be considered to be destined by the will of heaven to be the possessors of the relics. It chanced that the Winchcombe monks were the first to awake, and they were well on their way with their precious burden before their brethren of Worcester were aware of their departure. The return journey was managed without adventure till they reached a point high up in the hillside over against Winchcombe town, and some 2 miles distant therefrom. Here the good monks found themselves overcome with thirst, and offered up prayers that for the love of St. Kenelm some refreshing drink might be granted to them. Immediately a second miraculous spring, for another had already appeared under the thorn bush in Clent, gushed forth from the hillside, a spring which was long famous for its wonderful healing properties. The spring was covered with a well house, which may be seen to this day, and a chapel was erected hard by, which was only pulled down in the last century. But to return to the convoy. Thus refreshed, the procession filed up Winchcombe Street on its way to the Abbey, and here a terrible thing happened. The wicked Quenrine, with her psalter in her hand, was watching the approach of the procession from a window of the palace. As appropriate to the occasion, she had chosen for recitation the 109th Psalm, in which the psalmist calls down the vengeance of heaven upon his adversaries. To render the charm more effective, when she reached the end of the psalm, she began to recite it backwards, and had just reached the 20th verse as her brother's corpse was borne beneath her window. But she got no further with her reading, for at this moment her eyes fell out upon the open psalter, and the book, stained with her blood, was thereafter piously preserved among the sacred treasures of the Abbey. I'm really enjoying this search for gruesome stories from the Cotswolds. It has reintroduced me to one of my favourite authors, H. Munro, commonly known as Saki. I have a small, poignant and wonderful story for you now, called The Reticence of Lady Anne. Egbert came into the large, dimly lit drawing room with the air of a man who is not certain whether he's entering a dovecote or a bomb factory, and is prepared for either eventuality. The little domestic quarrel over the luncheon table had not been fought to a definite finish, and the question was how far Lady Anne was in a mood to renew or forego hostilities. Her pose in the armchair by the tea-table was rather elaborately rigid. In the gloom of a December afternoon, Egbert's pince-nez did not materially help him to discern the expression of her face. By way of breaking whatever ice might be floating on the surface, he made a remark about a dim, religious light. He or Lady Anne were accustomed to make that remark between 4:30 and 6 on winter and late autumn evenings. It was a part of their married life. There was no recognised rejoinder to it, and Lady Anne made none. Don Tarquinio lay astretch on the Persian rug, basking in the firelight with superb indifference to the possible ill humour of Lady Anne. His pedigree was as flawlessly Persian as the rug, and his ruff was coming into the glory of its second winter. The page boy, who had Renaissance tendencies, had christened him Don Tarquinio. Left to themselves, Egbert and Lady Anne would unfailingly have called him Fluff, but they were not obstinate. Egbert poured himself out some tea. As the silence gave no sign of breaking on Lady Anne's initiative, he braced himself for another Yermak effort. "My remark at lunch had a purely academic application," he announced. "You seem to put an unnecessarily personal significance into it." Lady Anne maintained her defensive barrier of silence. The bullfinch lazily filled in the interval with an air from Iphigénie en Tauride. Egbert recognized it immediately because it was the only air the bullfinch whistled, and he had come to them with the reputation for whistling it. Both Egbert and Lady Anne would have preferred something from the Yeoman of the Guard, which was their favourite opera. In matters artistic, they had a similarity of taste. They leaned towards the honest and explicit in art, a picture, for instance, that told its own story with generous assistance from its title. A riderless warhorse with harness in obvious disarray, staggering into a courtyard full of pale, swooning women, and marginally noted "bad news," suggested to their minds a distinct interpretation of some military catastrophe. They could see what it was meant to convey and explain it to friends of duller intelligence. The silence continued. As a rule, Lady Anne's displeasure became articulate and markedly voluble after 4 minutes of introductory muteness. Egbert seized the milk jug and poured some of its contents into Don Tarquinio's saucer. As the saucer was already full to the brim, an unsightly overflow was the result. Don Tarquinio was prepared to play many roles in life, but a vacuum carpet cleaner was not one of them. "Don't you think we're being rather foolish?" said Egbert cheerfully. If Lady Anne thought so, she didn't say so. "I dare say the fault's been partly on my side," continued Egbert, with evaporating cheerfulness. "After all, I'm only human, you know. You seem to forget I'm only human." He insisted on the point as if there had been unfounded suggestions that he was built on satire lines, with goat continuations where the human left off. The bullfinch recommenced its air from Iphigénie et Tauride. Egbert began to feel depressed. Lady Anne was not drinking her tea. Perhaps she was feeling unwell, but when Lady Anne felt unwell, she was not wont to be reticent on the subject. "No one knows what I suffer from indigestion," was one of her favourite statements, but the lack of knowledge can only have been caused by defective listening. The amount of information available on the subject would have supplied material for a monograph. Evidently, Lady Anne was not feeling unwell. Egbert began to think he was being unreasonably dealt with. Naturally, he began to make concessions. "I dare say," he observed, taking as central a position on the hearthrug as Don Tarquinio could be persuaded to concede him, "I may have been to blame. I'm willing, if I can thereby restore things to a happier standpoint, to undertake to lead a better life." He wondered vaguely how it would be possible. Temptations came to him in middle age, tentatively and without insistence, like a neglected butcher boy who asks for a Christmas box in February for no more hopeful reason than he didn't get one in December. He had no more idea of succumbing to them than he had of purchasing the fish knives and fur boas that ladies are impelled to sacrifice through the medium of advertisement columns during 12 months of the year. Still, there was something impressive in this unasked-for renunciation of possibly latent enormities. Lady Anne showed no sign of being impressed. Egbert looked at her nervously through his glasses. To get the worst of an argument with her was no new experience. To get the worst of a monologue was a humiliating novelty. "I shall go and dress for dinner," he announced in a voice into which he intended some shade of sternness to creep. At the door, a final access of weakness impelled him to make a further appeal. "Aren't we being very silly?" "A fool," was Don Tarquinio's mental comment as the door closed on Egbert's retreat. Then he lifted his velvet forepaws in the air and leapt lightly onto a bookshelf immediately under the bullfinch's cage. It was the first time he had seemed to notice the bird's existence, but he was carrying out a long-formed theory of action with the precision of mature deliberation. The bullfinch, who had fancied himself something of a despot, depressed himself of a sudden into a third of his normal displacement. Then he fell to a helpless wing-beating and shrill cheeping. He had cost 27 shillings without the cage, but Lady Anne made no sign of interfering. She had been dead for 2 hours. We round off tonight with another chilling tale, August Heat by William Freya Harvey. I have had what I believe to be the most remarkable day in my life. And while the events are still fresh in my mind, I wish to put them down on paper as clearly as possible. Let me say at the outset that my name is James Clarence Withencroft. I'm 40 years old, in perfect health, never having known a day's illness. By profession, I'm an artist. Not a very successful one, but I earn enough money by my black and white work to satisfy my necessary wants. My only near relative, a sister, died 5 years ago, so that I'm independent. I breakfasted this morning at 9, and after glancing through the morning paper, I lighted my pipe and proceeded to let my mind wander, in the hope that I might chance upon some subject for my pencil. The room, though door and windows were open, was oppressively hot, and I had just made up my mind that the coolest and most comfortable place in the neighbourhood would be the deep end of the public swimming bath, when the idea came. I began to draw. So intent was I on my work that I left my lunch untouched, only stopping work when the clock of St. Jude's struck 4. The final result, for a hurried sketch, was, I felt sure, the best thing I had done. It showed a criminal in the dock immediately after the judge had pronounced sentence. The man was fat, enormously fat. The flesh hung in rolls about his chin. It creased his huge, stumpy neck. He was clean-shaven. Perhaps I should say a few days before he must have been clean-shaven, and almost bald. He stood in the dock, his short, clumsy fingers clasping the rail, looking straight in front of him. The feeling that his expression conveyed was not so much one of horror as of utter, absolute collapse. There seemed nothing in the man strong enough to sustain that mountain of flesh. I rolled up the sketch, and without quite knowing why, placed it in my pocket. Then, with the rare sense of happiness which the knowledge of a good thing well done gives, I left the house. I believe that I set out with the idea of calling upon Trenton, for I remember walking along Lytton Street and turning to the right along Gilchrist Road at the bottom of the hill, where the men were at work on the new tram lines. From there onwards, I have only the vaguest recollection of where I went. The one thing of which I was fully conscious was the awful heat that came up from the dusty asphalt pavement as an almost palpable wave. I longed for the thunder promised by the great banks of copper-coloured cloud that hung low over the western sky. I must have walked 5 or 6 miles when a small boy roused me from my reverie by asking the time. It was 20 minutes to 7. When he left me, I began to take stock of my bearings. I found myself standing before a gate that led into a yard bordered by a strip of thirsty earth, where there were flowers, purple stock and scarlet geranium. Above the entrance was a board with the inscription, "Charles Atkinson, monumental mason, worker in English and Italian marbles." From the yard itself came a cheery whistle, the noise of hammer blows, and the cold sound of steel meeting stone. A sudden impulse made me enter. A man was sitting with his back towards me, busy at work on a slab of curiously veined marble. He turned round as he heard my steps, and I stopped short. It was the man I had been drawing, whose portrait lay in my pocket. He sat there, huge and elephantine, the sweat pouring from his scalp, which he wiped with a red silk handkerchief. But though the face was the same, the expression was absolutely different. He greeted me, smiling, as if we were old friends, and shook my hand. I apologized for my intrusion. "Everything is hot and glary outside," I said. "This seems an oasis in the wilderness." "I don't know about an oasis," he replied, "but it's certainly hot, as hot as hell. Take a seat, sir." He pointed to the end of the gravestone on which he was working, and I sat down. "That's a beautiful piece of stone you've got hold of," I said. He shook his head. "In a way it is," he answered. "The surface here is as fine as anything you could wish, but there's a big flaw at the back, though I don't expect you'd ever notice it. I could never make really a good job of a bit of marble like that. It would be all right in the summer like this. It wouldn't mind the blasted heat. But wait till the winter comes. There's nothing quite like frost to find out the weak points in stone." "Then what's it for?" I asked. The man burst out laughing. "You'd hardly believe me if I was to tell you. It's for an exhibition, but it's the truth. Artists have exhibitions, so do grocers and butchers. We have them too. All the latest little things and headstones, you know." He went on to talk of marbles, which sort best withstood wind and rain, and which were easiest to work. Then of his garden and a new sort of carnation he'd bought. At the end of every other minute he would drop his tools, wipe his shining head, and curse the heat. I said little, for I felt uneasy. There was something unnatural, uncanny, in meeting this man. I tried at first to persuade myself that I'd seen him before, that his face, unknown to me, had found a place in some out-of-the-way corner of my memory, but I knew that I was practising little more than a plausible piece of self-deception. Mr. Atkinson finished his work, spat on the ground, and got up with a sigh of relief. "There, what do you think of that?" he said, with an air of evident pride. The inscription, which I read for the first time, was this: "Sacred to the memory of James Clarence Withencroft. Born January the 18th, 1860, he passed away very suddenly on August the 20th, 19. In the midst of life we are in death." For some time I sat in silence. Then a cold shudder ran down my spine. I asked him where he'd seen the name. "Oh, I didn't see it anywhere," replied Mr. Atkinson. "I wanted some name, and I put down the first that came into my head. Why do you want to know?" "It's a strange coincidence, but it happens to be mine." He gave a long, low whistle. "And the dates?" "Well, I can only answer for one of them, and that's correct." "It's a rum go," he said. But he knew less than I did. I told him of my morning's work. I took the sketch from my pocket and showed it to him. As he looked, the expression of his face altered, until it became more and more like that of the man I'd drawn. "And it was only the day before yesterday," he said, "that I told Maria there were no such things as ghosts." Neither of us had seen a ghost, but I knew what he meant. "You probably heard my name," I said. "And you must have seen me somewhere and have forgotten it. Were you at Clacton-on-Sea last July?" I'd never been to Clacton in my life. We were silent for some time. We were both looking at the same thing, the two dates on the gravestone, and one was right. "Come inside and have some supper," said Mr. Atkinson. His wife is a cheerful little woman with the flaky red cheeks of the country bred. Her husband introduced me as a friend of his who was an artist. The result was unfortunate, for after the sardines and watercress had been removed, she brought out a Doré Bible, and I had to sit and express my admiration for nearly half an hour. I went outside and found Atkinson sitting on the gravestone smoking. We resumed the conversation at the point we'd left off. "You must excuse my asking," I said, "but do you know of anything you've done for which you could be put on trial?" He shook his head. "I'm not a bankrupt. The business is prosperous enough. 3 years ago I gave turkeys to some of the guardians at Christmas, but that's all I can think of. They were small ones too," he added as an afterthought. He got up, fetched a can from the porch, and began to water the flowers. "Twice a day regular in the hot weather," he said, "and then the heat sometimes gets the better of the delicate ones. And ferns, good Lord, they could never stand it. Where do you live?" I told him my address. It would take an hour's quick walk to get back home. "It's like this," he said. "We'll look at the matter straight. If you go back home tonight, you take your chance of accidents. A cart may run over you, and there's always banana skins and orange peel, to say nothing of falling ladders." He spoke of the improbable with an intense seriousness that would have been laughable 6 hours before, but I did not laugh. "The best thing we can do," he continued, "is for you to stay here till 12 o'clock. We'll go upstairs and smoke. It may be cooler inside." To my surprise, I agreed. We are sitting now in a long, low room beneath the eaves. Atkinson has sent his wife to bed. He himself is busy sharpening some tools at a little oilstone, smoking one of my cigars the while. The air seems charged with thunder. I'm writing this at a shaky table before the open window. The leg is cracked, and Atkinson, who seems a handy man with his tools, is going to mend it as soon as he has finished putting an edge on his chisel. It's after 11 now. I shall be gone in less than an hour. But the heat is stifling. It's enough to send a man mad. Thank you for watching our Halloween specials. We do hope you've enjoyed them. You can follow our haunted routes yourself. Our guidebook is available below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and have a wonderful Halloween.